Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Zyrus, and welcome to Derms on Drugs, a new video podcast brought to you by Scholars in Medicine. Derms on Drugs is where cutting-edge derm meets mediocre comedy. I'm Matt Zyrus, and each week I'm joined by my residency buddies, Dr. Tim Patton and Dr. Laura Ferris, and we use our 60 years of combined derm experience to debate, dissect, and discuss the hottest topics in dermatology. It's everything you need to know to be on the cutting edge of derm. It's where you get to have some fun listening to us do the work of a journal club. So join us every Friday here at Derms on Drugs on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and in Scholars in Medicine. So let's go ahead and get into it. This week we've got a very special episode, and I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Patton to kind of take us through one of the most interesting articles that I've seen in, say, the last 6 months. Dr. Patton, why don't you go ahead and take it from there?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about an article that is available online as of October in 2024 in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology. It's by Kuchera et al., and it's titled Evaluation of Benzene Presence and Formation in Benzoyl Peroxide Drug Products. The article reported the results of tests that were performed on multiple over-the-counter BPO products.
Was this the first like peer-reviewed article that you saw? Because I know the benzoyl peroxide thing came out a while ago.
March 2024. So this is October.
Right. But in March, it wasn't like a peer-reviewed article, right? It was just like
it was a FDA citizen petition or something.
All right. So this is like the first big peer-reviewed.
Yeah, it was like an official article.
Okay. All right.
As far as I know.
All right. But our guests might have more to tell us about this.
They might be able to
along first.
That a little bit better. All right. So they looked at multiple over-the-counter BPO products to see if they could detect benzene. Why do we care about benzene? It's listed as a known human carcinogen, so that's bad. We can't avoid it entirely. It's all around us. It's around us right now. We're getting killed by benzene as we speak, but we should make sure that we are being exposed to as little as it as possible. So this study performed 4 tests, and I completely understood all of them. I have most of this equipment in my basement. I actually don't have this. If I screw up any of these tests, that is totally my fault. All right. So first test, they took 111 BPO products. They incubated them for 20 minutes at 37 degrees Celsius. That is body temperature. And then they measured benzene levels using GCM, at gas chromatography mass spectra something. 34% of the products tested had benzene levels above 2 parts per million. That's the limit that is set by the FDA. Figure 1 shows the results from some of the products tested. Proactive, like doing horribly. What are you guys doing? Proactive. The next test looked at one specific BPO product, Ep5. It contains encapsulated BPO. When the product was kept at 2 degrees Celsius, even after 12 days, the amount of benzene was negligible compared to heating the BPO product to 50 degrees. For normal people, that is 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Linear increase in benzene over time. Did they also test it at room temperature? No. Why not? Because honestly, they said they ran out of Ep5. So why did you test it at 50 degrees? That just doesn't seem clinically relevant. They make a note in the text that anecdotally something or other at room temperature, there's no detectable BPO. All right. So the last two tests.
BPO or benzene? Because I would hope.
No detectable benzene. I'm sorry.
All right. I would hope there was detectable BPO in the Ep5.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's not going to work. It'd be a terrible drug. Don't buy it.
Yeah.
All right. So then the last 2 tests were, hey, what's it like when you put this on the skin? Does it like evaporate into the air and basically poison you from like a vapor test? So they put the really highest level, which was this cleanser by Proactive, which that's kind of a weird test to do, right? Where you put a cleanser on, you wash it off. It's not like you put it on your skin and leave it there. But they took this really, really high product. They put it on these plates. They did 24 hours in the dark, and then they did it after exposing it to UVA-B for a couple of hours. Figure 3 shows the results of these in parts per billion. They converted that to like, how many micrograms does this mean? So for the dark study, 4 micrograms of benzene. And the UV BPO product, it would be 14.7. Our daily exposure, maybe on the order of 100 or 300 micrograms. So I guess those are small total amounts. And it was a product with really high levels of benzene. And like I said, it was a cleanser. So that's not really how we use cleansers. We don't put them on their skin. But even with the worst product and leaving it and using it in a way that we wouldn't use, the levels of benzene are really, really low. So, you know, that's the paper. So taken on face value, haha, get it, face. What do you guys think? Benzene, are we worried? Are we not?
Well, first I'll let you answer first. How did you feel after you looked at this article for the first time?
So when I first looked at it, I thought, oh my gosh, this is like kind of frightening. And I guess it makes sense to, get it really, really hot to accelerate what's going to happen. And this is mimicking real world. And, I thought, okay, I guess I should be warning patients are not using, benzoyl peroxide. And I thought back to the sunscreen, benzene stuff that we dealt with, a couple of years ago. And but on like kind of further critical review, and then looking at putting that into the context of real world application, I think it's less concerning. And then I kind of thought, I'm interested to learn more. Like, where did this all come from? Why did we start worrying about this? And why are we making much ado about nothing?
And I'll tell you, I had kind of when the benzene stuff first came out, I was like, this sounds like crap. This is ridiculous. I'm not going to blah. And then when this article came out, I was like, oh my God, this is in JID. It's been peer reviewed. Benzene sounds awful. Oh my God, I need to start telling everybody about benzene. And good Lord, I've been totally wrong. It was kind of my takeaway. And that's where I was putting it until Dr. Patton helped me find some alternative information that I'm now going to bring our guests in. So we've got two really interesting people with us. So first, Dr. John Barbieri, who is a dermatologist practicing in Boston, I believe at Mass General, the Harvard system, who's an extremely well-known acne expert. And then we've got Dr. Michelle Wong, who is a PhD doctor, so an actual real doctor, not like the rest of us, who is a cosmetic chemist, who actually really understands kind of the methodologies that were used. And so first, I just want to say hi to the two of you guys and appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's just kind of get started here. So Michelle, take us through, well, you know what, actually I'm going to give people the thing that they really want to hear first. So John is an very well-known acne expert here in the United States. John, yes or no, in your opinion, should derms be like terrified or worried at all about benzene in benzoyl peroxide?
No, I definitely don't think we should be terrified. I do think this is an important issue for us to think about how we can optimize the safety of these products, but I definitely don't think we need to be going to people's houses and like hitting the benzoyl peroxide out of their hands before it kills them either.
You're going to take it off the acne guidelines?
Yeah, I think it's still going to be in the guidelines.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So let's kind of get into this. So Michelle, you are a chemist. And so you understand all of this stuff in ways that, John, I don't know if you happen to be a chemist as well, but me, Pat, and Ferris sure aren't. And so kind of take us through, were the methods valid? If they weren't valid, how were they not valid? Like how do you think about this?
So I think the biggest problem is the way they've interpreted their data. So they've presented their methods as realistic, which if you actually analyze like the temperatures they use, the UV exposure they use, it's not really reflecting real world situations. And they do claim that it is in the discussion. And I think it's one of those things where in peer review papers, most of the time people are looking at the methods, they're peer reviewing that part, and then the discussion is kind of like hand wavy. Everyone expects some sort of puffery in the discussion. And so it doesn't really necessarily reflect realistic use. So they did actually publish another paper.
I just have to say I love it anytime somebody uses the word puffery. You've got me sold at puffery. All right. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, so they had two papers. They actually had one earlier in Environmental Health Perspectives, which was the one where they presented their petition data on higher temperatures. So they heated up the benzoyl peroxide and measured the benzene. Benzoyl peroxide breaks down to make benzene, and that breakdown is faster with things like heat and UV. Sort of like that, I don't know if you remember from high school chemistry, but if you heat stuff up, you get more energy in there, you get more bonds breaking, you get more stuff happening. So they heated it up and they decomposed it and they measured how much there was, but then with the temperatures they used, they linked it to situations where it wasn't entirely realistic. So one example is, the 37 degrees in skin temperature. 37 degrees is like more internal temperature. Skin is a lot colder than somewhere deeper in your body. So skin is probably closer to room temperature than 37 degrees. It's like a good 10 degrees Celsius below. So 37 Celsius, I'm Australian, so I'm going to keep saying Celsius. I'm sorry. Feel free to jump in.
For us Americans, 10 degrees
Fahrenheit.
Celsius is about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're looking, instead of 98 degrees, 80 degrees is probably skin temperature.
Yeah, so one of the main experiments they did was putting it at 70 degrees Celsius, which is 158 Fahrenheit. I know this one. And they said this was the temperature of a supposed hot car. But if you actually just go on Google and just look up hot car temperature, you'll see that it's actually usually 50 to 60 or 130 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a good chunk below. And they left it in there for 2 weeks. So it turns out they referenced a paper where they had a hot car parked in the full sun in Atlanta. And that day was like an almost 40-degree day. So they had that in there for 2 weeks, which not really realistic unless like global warming gets really bad.
40-degree day, again, for all of our Americans, is probably like 110 Fahrenheit ballpark.
Yeah, so not super realistic for the JID with the UV. So they put it under a lizard lamp for, I think, a few hours. But I did some recalculation. So I recalibrated it to the UV index, which is largely UVB, which is what benzoyl peroxide absorbs. So kind of similar to weighting the UV by sunburn. So it turns out to be the equivalent of a full summer's day worth of UV with UV index 9. That's like low for Australia, probably quite high for most of the US. And of course, that was with the cleanser, as Tim mentioned. Generally, you don't go outside for a full summer's day with cleanser on your face. And again, that was still quite low. And also, if you're outside, that benzene is going to be drifting off. There's actual ventilation. It's going to be massively diluted. The main way we're exposed to benzene is through inhalation. Not a lot goes through skin, but if you inhale it, about half of that goes into your blood.
I assumed a lot of it went through your skin. Huh.
Yeah, you might think that, but our skin is actually a pretty good barrier to most things, and benzene is one of them. So most of the studies done on skin exposure is with occupational exposure. Workers like having their hands in benzene for hours. Usually it's like mechanics, because petrol has 1%, which is, I think, 10,000 parts per million. Benzene. So that gives you a sort of indication of parts per million, which is the unit they tend to use.
So has anybody actually done this study just by measuring serum benzene levels? So have people who use benzoyl peroxide every day and see if you can detect serum, benzene?
Yes, I can take that one. We've sort of done that study. So using NHANES, there's data on benzene levels. There's also data on what kinds of medications people are using. So we did a study using NHANES looking at people who were using benzoyl peroxide containing products. We matched them to people who were not, trying to control for any other kind of lifestyle, socioeconomic, et cetera, variable that we could to make these people as similar as possible in every other way. And we found there was absolutely no difference in the likelihood of them having detectable blood benzene, and no difference in the levels of blood benzene when they were detected between those two groups. So
now, John, I want to jump in and ask you a question there for a second. So I'm big into like dietary nickel. And dietary nickel is something where the normal blood tests are looking for like nickel toxicity, where like, oh my God, you'd have to like bathe in nickel to be able to get it. They're not useful for detecting, what I would call normal amounts of nickel that you would get in your diet. The testing that they did in NHANES for benzene, if there was a potentially clinically relevant amount of benzene getting into people's body, would it have picked it up?
my understanding is yes. Now, again, I'm not a an expert in the NHANES method. I wasn't there doing it. I didn't
Yeah,
do that part of the study, but I think their methodology is viewed as relatively robust. And the fact that they do detect benzene in a number of individuals in both groups, it's not just like everyone's zero and they're having a floor effect. They're detecting benzene in people because it's unfortunately around us in our daily lives, and they're not finding differences in those who are exposed to benzoyl peroxide containing products.
Okay.
Seems like that's kind of the answer in the end, right? And
I would
did
say
you look
part
at
of the
that?
answer.
Yeah.
Right, it's an observational study. So, it wasn't designed for that purpose. There's always the potential for unmeasured confounding. They're relatively small sample sizes. So I wouldn't take it as like that's the answer, but I do think that it's reassuring. We also did another study looking at a larger cohort in TriNetX of 27,000 individuals who are using benzoyl peroxide, again, trying to match them as best we could to individuals who weren't, and saw a dermatologist for like a mole check. And again, here we were looking at cancer. So that's ultimately what we care about, right? Are you at higher risk of cancer? And with a mean follow-up of over 7 years for both groups, we didn't detect any differences in hematologic or internal malignancies between the groups. So again, all the caveats of observational data, unmeasured confounding, but I do think both of those studies give us some reassurance that in real-world use conditions, people who are using benzoyl peroxide containing products don't seem to be at higher levels of having detectable benzene in their blood or increased risk of cancer. And as Dr. Patton pointed out earlier, just do the thought experiment. Take the worst products that Valisure is, including in their studies, and just think about the absolute level of benzene in those products. As Dr. Wong mentioned, absorption through the skin is less than like 1 to 5%, so it's not like it's going to give you skin cancer from being on your skin. The risk is that it aerosolizes as you inhale it. And if you think about the quantities of benzene that are even in those worst products that Valisure is testing, and if you give them the benefit of the doubt that all that testing is right, which is a whole secondary issue, but let's assume it's right, let's take the worst product, that absolute level of benzene is very small compared to, unfortunately, the benzene we get exposed to from just existing in the modern world. And so when you do that thought experiment, that's kind of reassuring too, that it makes sense that it's probably not going to create a clinical risk. It's just like, UV is a known human carcinogen. And, when you sit inside a building, there's some UV that goes in the window, you're getting exposed to some, there's no safe level of UV, but the actual, risk of that is probably relatively low.
Oh, John, I'm gonna argue with you there, because we had a guest on a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Richard Weller from the UK, who's actually shown that UV is highly beneficial from a cardiovascular perspective.
Oh yeah, there's that aspect of it too. But from a skin cancer standpoint, there's sort of the same argument they would make. There's no safe level of UV for skin cancer, just like there's no safe level of benzene for lymphoma. But the dose makes the poison. You can have a low enough level where it's not really clinically relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I tell people that all the time, that if you want to look hard enough, like water is a horrible. I always like, I don't know, Michelle, I'm sure in the chemistry world, people talk about this all the time, but the horrible dangers of dihydrogen monoxide, which has killed more people than any other chemical in the history of the world. In fact, a tablespoon of it can be absolutely lethal, and thousands of people a year die from exposure. And the famous studies about this are you can get almost everyone to agree that dihydrogen monoxide should be banned in all shapes and forms. And of course, dihydrogen monoxide is water. You can make anything sound awful if you try hard enough. So
Michelle, could you maybe go into the lab Valisure itself? This is not their first sort of rodeo of telling us that things that we wouldn't expect to kill us are going to kill us. Can you go into those details a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So Valishure's had a sort of history of submitting lots of petitions. I can't remember if this is like maybe number 7 or something, but they started off with Zantac. Actually, they started off with something before Zantac. I think it was valsartan. But they found NDMA in Zantac and in metformin. You might remember those scares. So Zantac's been withdrawn from the market, but now that's being questioned. So they had Zantac, they tested it, and they found NDMA, which is a carcinogen. The FDA started investigating. Actually, it was like a worldwide investigation. It was like all the regulatory agencies around the world started investigating. And eventually the FDA realized that what Valisure did was they heated it up too much. So GCMS is gas phase chromatography. So you need to heat up your thing until it's a gas and then pass it through a column. And it turns out when they heated it, the Zantac decomposed, and there's a photo in an FDA presentation where it's actually black. Zantac does not start off black, it starts off white. The little sample vial was black, and it turns out they generated the NDMA by heating it up too much, which is kind of a running theme here. So they couldn't actually use any of their data because it was all not quite right. They had to rerun all the tests. With metformin, that was also, they detected it, they made a big fuss about it, it was in a whole bunch of newspapers, and it turns out, okay, so this might get a little bit into the weeds, but essentially with GCMS, you end up with a line and then a peak, like a little hump, and you measure the area of the hump. It turns out the hump for NDMA overlapped with the hump for something else, and so it got a lot bigger, and they reported that all as NDMA, but it was, I think, about half something else as well. So all their values were inflated, all their measurements, and so the risk was like a whole bunch higher than it should have been for just metformin. So interestingly, pretty much every time a public health agency has made an announcement based on their own analysis of the data, they've always said something like, there is not expected to be an actual adverse health effect from using these products. So the way that Valisure presents their data, historically it's like a good order of magnitude above the risk of what the health agencies end up saying it is. So I think that's pretty reassuring in general for anything that comes from Valisure.
So the big question is why? Like, why are they doing this? Are they mean? Are they evil? Like, what? Why? I don't understand.
In general, I like to think that most of these incorrect results are mostly from people genuinely trying to do the right thing and genuinely having their just interpreting their results in an honest way. With Valisure, I think there are a few other extra factors which might be relevant. So first off, in every petition, they do ask for the FDA to install them as like an extra layer of quality control for pharmaceuticals / cosmetics, which is kind of weird because the FDA has actually published papers specifically criticizing their methods, which is pretty unusual. So they specifically talk about like the double hump issue, for example, in one paper. But obviously, like, there's a lot of money in this sort of contract, just like testing everything on the market. They did get a contract with the Department of Defense for this, which, well done to them. They do also have ties with class action lawyers. There are some lawsuits that were filed before the petitions became public. So that kind of raises the question of, do they genuinely think this is in the public interest, or is it some sort of financial motive? For benzoyl peroxide specifically, a few people from Valisure actually filed a patent over a year before the petition, and this patent contains the data on how much benzene there is, similar amounts to their petitions and their studies. So again, big question mark about their public interest. And the Wall Street Journal has a couple articles about how these lawsuits were filed before the public announcements. They were also responsible for a dry shampoo story about benzene in dry shampoo. And in the court filing, it seems like they sent a letter to Unilever to keep their testing info confidential if they paid up. I think it was something like $1 million and then $250,000 every few months or something as a retainer. So supposedly that's been sent to more than one company.
Extortion.
And Michelle, I went in.
Oh, alleged.
You know, the patent thing is fascinating because I will tell you, one of the reasons I was found this all credible is I couldn't think of a reason like why. It's not like Valishure's coming up with an alternative to benzoyl peroxide that's like, oh, you should use our stuff instead of benzoyl peroxide. But the patent that they filed on a way to stabilize benzoyl peroxide so it doesn't release benzene. Well, once you've got a patent on that, you then need to if you get people worried about benzene and benzoyl peroxide, now everybody's going to want to use your method to make sure there's no benzene in the benzoyl peroxide. So I certainly don't know that there was anything, nefarious going on here. But they certainly have a reason to want people to be worried about benzene and benzoyl peroxide. And it really becomes just a fascinating topic of sort of these kinds of, webs of conflicts, potential conflicts of interest. And it's something, you know, I certainly even struggle with, right? I do a lot of work with a lot of drug companies, and then I talk about articles that get published. And so it's, you know, it's not like people are, you know, conflicts of interest are innately a bad thing, but I think it's really important that we are aware of conflicts of interest, right? That's why we really try and make them well known whenever we're doing continuing medical education or we're talking about a drug or a side effect or a benefit or whatever. It's just fascinating. Man.
So, John, I had another question about, you know, the practical advice you give people, right? I mean, there's like two ways you could go about it. You could take all this data on face value, like don't read into the details. There were products that did really well, even with these unrealistic experiments. Clean and Clear, Equate, Neutrogena, Walgreens. None of the products, even with the crazy testing that Ballinger seemed to be doing here, none of those reached that 2 parts per million set by the FDA. So you could say, use those. You could tell them to refrigerate the product with the Epsilon data, certainly. But that kind of lends like maybe more credence than you need to. And so the opposite way is to be like, yeah, this lab is kind of shady and don't believe anything they say. Just use whatever you want. Is there an in between? Which way do you lean towards?
I think there's a few parts to that question. So first, you bring up there's a lot of heterogeneity in the different brands in their most recent paper in the Journal of Investigative Dermatology. And we actually took a look at their data and article on JAMA Dermatology. And when we did that, we found a lot of that heterogeneity is actually explained by the formulations of the product and potentially some of the manufacturing conditions, like how much heat might have the product been exposed to when they were making it. And so I think you can actually look at that heterogeneity, and it's an important opportunity for us to think about the supply chain, about how we formulate and distribute these products and opportunities to make them safer overall. I would be a little bit careful of like extrapolating those, like this brand is good and this brand is bad. Like they went to, you know, a store and bought a product, like it could be very different if they bought it from a different store. We don't know how replicatable those findings are. Sure. So I wouldn't use those the call out products, but I do think it gives us some good hypotheses to test in terms of what kinds of strategies when making a product keep them to having the lowest levels of benzene. In terms of actual suggestions for patients, kind of from a common sense approach, I tell people like, you know, benzoyl peroxide products, they do have the potential to break down into benzene when exposed to high temperatures. So, you know, try to store them at room temperature or cooler. I don't actually think we need to say refrigeration. Ballinger has never shown that refrigeration is helpful. Comparing refrigeration to 50 degrees shows 50 degrees is bad. It doesn't show refrigeration is good. I have no idea, like you pointed out, why they didn't do room temperature. To me, that's the obvious comparator if you want to make that complaint, that claim. But even if you only had enough product you want, do room temperature versus cool. But they didn't do that. I'm not sure why. Maybe we'll find out at some point. Yeah. But so I don't tell people necessarily they need to refrigerate it. It probably is better just because in general, cooler slows things down. But I think room temperature is likely fine. Our data, when we looked at it, didn't show any real risk with room temperature storage. Each 100 days closer to the expiration date you get on the products is associated with less than a 1 part per million increase in benzene. So I'm not so worried about that. I just say room temperature or cooler. If it's past the expiration date or more than a few months, throw it out. And I do think it has some implications for direct-to-consumer things. If you buy something on Amazon and it sits on your porch on a hot weather in, you know, Florida for 5 days while you're on a trip, that might actually lead to meaningful benzene. So I do think we can be a little bit thoughtful about shipping things like direct-to-consumer stuff, and that may be an important part of counseling. But beyond that, I think just common sense handling of the product is all we really need to do right now until we learn something more that changes our data.
So, John and Michelle, I got an interest. So, Patton actually brought up something related to this a few days ago that made me right. So, I send a fair amount of prescriptions now to these compounding pharmacies that, you know, are putting, you know, these 3 ingredients together that you can't get together in a, you know, any other way, especially for rosacea, that kind of stuff. And like, I was like, do we need to be worried about that stuff? Like, none of that's been tested. Like, we don't know what the hell's in there. Like, I'm still not worried about it because I figure that, you know, the pharmacies are reputable. They're not trying to like whatever. But do you think there's any concern around that kind of stuff? You know, based on, you know, your experience, Michelle, John, do either of you think, you know, is your answer like no idea? or like, I don't know, maybe? Like, how would you think about that?
I think with compounding, there's always a risk. With compounding, like the formulations just aren't really tested as much as an off-the-shelf product. So in general, I would probably not really go for the compounding option if it's an option. Yeah, it's really hard to say just because there's so much variability with how it's compounded, what it's compounded into, like what sort of base cream they're using, that kind of thing.
Okay. And so part of that takeaway is maybe it's worth getting to know, if you send compounded scripts, maybe it's worth talking to the pharmacy you send it to just to make sure that you're comfortable with them, that, you've kind of done your due diligence. But it's another interesting topic that just really it wasn't on my radar before this. Well, John and Michelle, I really want to thank you guys for coming on. This has been such a fascinating conversation, and I really hope it's going to give our listeners a kind of a different perspective on this whole benzene and benzoyl peroxide issue. Anything that either of you would like to say before we sign off?
I would say, I do think this is an issue. I'm glad we're talking about it. I think we need to take it seriously, but we need to not overreact. Let's not, freak out and start doing too much when really, in general, a lot of the clinical data, just the thought experiments suggest that, it is probably safe to use benzoyl peroxide products when handled appropriately.
All right.
Yeah, and I'd also add that sometimes things that you think would improve might not necessarily improve it. So, I don't actually really like the fridge advice because benzene is gas. Well, it's very volatile. It turns into a gas. And fridges are usually airtight. So it could actually be if you have a room temperature tube sitting in your bathroom, which is relatively well ventilated, compared to putting it in a fridge where it's trapped. And fridges, you're only decreasing the temperature by 20 degrees Celsius. If you think about actual energy with Kelvin, the other temperature scale, it's not actually decreasing it by that much. So you might actually be trapping the benzene and then getting a giant whiff every time you open the fridge. So yeah, it's best not to overreact when the risk is not that clear.
And before we go, I do want to put a plug in for Michelle's YouTube channel, where she just said it was the first place that I really was introduced to Dr. Wong. So what is there a name for do you have a name for your show? I actually don't know very much how YouTube works. Is that your main platform, or what's your channel called?
It's called Lab Muffin Beauty Science, and yeah, that is probably my main channel these days. And
what?
John also has a great channel, but I feel like most dermatologists probably know about that.
And what kind of stuff do you cover on there? Like, is it all sort of benzene and benzoyl peroxide, or is it into, does this product work? Does that product not work? How did that, what is your channel like?
I mostly break down the science behind different beauty products for a general audience. I talk about skincare, mostly hair care these days, because lots of people have tons of questions about that. There's things like rosemary oil. There's a lot of debunking of trends.
Interesting. Okay, because that is something that we as derms get asked a lot about. And it's just hard to keep up on. It's really hard to keep up on, does this work? Does that work? Whatever. So I think a channel like yours is super useful, and coming from somebody who knows what they're talking about and is reputable, and they're really well done videos. I've watched a few of them now, and you do a really nice job. So I really want to encourage everybody to check it out if you're interested. And again, tell us the name again. Where the hell did the name Lab Muffin come from?
Oh, I needed a name to start. I was never going to start if I didn't think up a name. I thought up the first name. I could change it later. Didn't change it. It's been 12 years.
Okay. So Lab Muffin on YouTube. And really, I got to just tell everybody, they are really well done videos and really entertaining. I actually really enjoyed watching them. So thanks, guys, for coming on today. And again, really appreciate it. So thanks for joining us this week for this fascinating conversation with Dr. John Barbieri and Dr. Michelle Wong. If you've got questions, comments, or ideas for topics we should cover on the show, shoot us an email at questions@dermsondrugs.com. Again, that's questions@dermsondrugs.com. And hope you learned a few things from the interview today. Hope maybe you laughed once or twice. And mostly, I hope you're planning to join us next week. And until then, I'm Matt Zyrus.
I'm Tim Patton.
I'm Laura Ferris, and we are Derms on Drugs.